We get used to figures we can't compute, amounts we can't compute. Give us the figure for the cost of climate change. How do you even compute it?
How much do you have? Thank you for the question, Joe. The question of the transition cost is a very important one. There's several estimates, and these are quite big figures, right? You can see from $3 to $4 trillion required investments every year. You can see this from the estimates of the IEA. You can see this from the estimates by the United Nations in terms of the financing for the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a lot of numbers going about, all of them, of course, within the framework of huge uncertainty in terms of what are the technologies, what is the speed of transition, and how quickly can we develop these capabilities and actually become efficient in terms of transitioning. So there's a lot of models out there that give us, in the ballpark, that sort of numbers.
And so the trillions, just talk us through over what time frame, how does that look?
Yeah, so you can see that the two major kind of milestones is 2030 and 2050, typically. And if we want to really be serious about transitioning to a low cost or a low carbon or a zero carbon economy, we should really be thinking about investments by 2050, but that number I think has several components, right? So one of them is this idea that we're very good at setting targets, but we're not particularly good at planning a transition. So if you think about cost, including reskilling, perhaps sunsetting some industries, perhaps also redeveloping some human capital, we haven't been particularly good in terms of estimating those effects. The second one is these huge inequalities between the global north and the global south. In other words, there is damage or a moral debt, as Nobel laureate Esther Duflo says in her latest work, that ought to be paid. In other words, the world's most vulnerable are suffering by the problem that we created. So that's another part of the cost. And finally, there is this idea of it's time to pay the bill in terms of recalibrating everything that we have destroyed in the process. Right? You can think about abuse of waste of resources. You can think about this as the collapse of biodiversity and therefore the need for regeneration. In other words, undoing the assets that we have depleted and therefore trying to give to the next generation a world that is not much worse, hopefully better, but not worse than one we had inherited, right? So if you add all these types of costs together, this is effectively how you get to these numbers. In addition to the idea that we need to be not only regenerating, but actually enhancing, improving all of these underlying infrastructure. So if you think about investments in R&D, investments in the energy system, the water system, even the digitization, which is a huge component of building a green economy. So I think those are the key elements of the cost, and half of it is obviously investment, not just cost.
How do you see this area, Simon?
Well, sure. If you're asking what's the cost of climate change itself, then I'd say that there are some questions where that's almost not the right question to ask, or you can't expect there to be a good number as an answer to that. I think probably none of us have ever seen a numerical estimate of the costs of nuclear war, because it's really not relevant. We all know that that's an unthinkable disaster, and it's something we want to avoid. I think about climate change the same way. We're talking about, everybody here heard the panel of scientists just now talking about destabilization of ecosystems on an incredible scale. That is just something catastrophic. There's nobody in the world that can put a sensible number on that. If any economist claims to, don't take them seriously. It really depends how much you care about the future of human civilization. On the other half, you can talk about numbers. What does it cost to decarbonize the global economy? And it involves significant investment. It involves maybe $2, $3, or $4 trillion a year globally of additional investment compared to carrying on with a fossil-fueled energy system. But it also has enormous operational savings because you're just harvesting sunlight and wind instead of digging up loads of fossils every year and burning them. And the best current estimates are that the transition as a whole will actually save money, that a fast global transition to net zero will save around $12 trillion by 2050. Of course, there's a big uncertainty range there, but that's our best estimate. It's a large net saving. So the problem is not, as people often think, about how you allocate the costs. When you think about it in big picture terms, the problem is how you allocate the savings. How do you allocate those savings across the population, across different places, and over time? And of course, that gives you the opportunity to really direct some of that money you've saved at supporting the people and the places that are going to find it much hardest, the hardest to make the transition.
But getting to those savings is going to cost a huge amount of money, and it's the issue obviously of finding that up front and how that breaks down between public and private investment.
Yeah, there's going to be upfront investment, and that definitely has challenges, but we don't have to think about even that part as finding new money. Industry is making investments all the time. You know, the car industry, for example, 2 trillion a year global industry. All the time there's industrial capital going into developing new models. With the right regulations, you shift that industrial capital from the fossil fuel technology to the clean technology, and it's going into where it needs to go. It's forcing innovation, it's bringing down the costs of the clean technologies. I think probably this is a room full of innovators. I think everybody would understand that here.
Mm-hmm. But then why isn't it so straightforward? I mean, put like that, it sounds quite straightforward, Ioannis. What's going wrong?
Well, the difficult part is who is going to pay upfront, right? And you can think about this in terms of what the government is going to do, what the private sector is going to do, businesses, and what we, our consumers, are going to do. And I think the distribution rather, of those costs is going to differ across industries. So one can imagine that in industries where, in economics jargon, you would say that the consumers are more inelastic in terms of what they are willing to pay for a particular product or service, then they'll have to pay more, right, if it's an essential good. And similarly, in other industries where, for example, renewables, where the renewable technologies need subsidies on behalf of the government, clearly a lot of the upfront costs will go from the government. The challenge here, I think, is devising sector-specific transition plans and really understanding how this distribution across these three main players, the governments, the businesses, and us, the consumers, is going to play out. And why is that the case? Because depending on the industry that we're talking about, you're going to have a lot of justice and fairness issues to consider. So for instance, you don't want to impose the same cost across all income levels in a particular country, right? You want to make sure that everyone kind of can carry the burden that they can, and not anything that is disproportionately penalizing them. So all those are considerations that need to be taken into account. And we have seen also smart policies. So for instance, consider the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. Of course, they invested $369 billion as part of promoting the green transition, but it was a smart law in the sense that was the government's part, but it unleashed, quite literally, according to some estimates, trillions of private investment into the several sectors. So we do also have the financial instruments, the multilateral banks and so on, that can create these multiplier effects of initial investment in order to help us cover that cost. So we mentioned earlier, though, the distributional issue is very important. And I think, frankly, if you look around the world, if you see, for instance, the protest in terms of farming, if you see the Gilets jaunes in France a couple of years ago, and if we continue on this path of not paying attention to a just transition, not just a transition, we're going to see a lot more of that and more deterioration of social cohesion, which ultimately is going to make this challenge even more difficult to resolve and more costly to resolve if we don't understand the dynamics of how we're going to get there.
Mm-hmm. Simon, obviously, I mean, it costs individuals money to upgrade, to change, and Ioannis describing there the importance of kind of not making people do what they can't afford. But how good are governments, how good is our government at supporting subsidy to make sure that the rollouts happen as efficiently and as quickly as possible?
Yeah, I think Ioannis is exactly right, that what works in terms of policy varies greatly depending on the sector. And really in the UK, there's one sector where we've done well, and that's the power sector, electricity generation, where the UK has decarbonized that sector roughly 8 times faster than the global average over the last decade. And there are a couple of significant parts of that. One was subsidizing renewable technologies, like virtually every other country has done, solar, wind, offshore wind. And the other part was a carbon tax and a carbon trading system, which together just happened to make coal more expensive than gas. So at a point where you had the renewables growing, you had the coal and gas shrinking, fighting over a smaller share of the market, this carbon tax made coal go from being cheaper than gas to more expensive than gas, and crossed that tipping point that made the coal plants unprofitable. Lots of them got closed down, taken out of the system. Coal's share of generation went from about 40% of the mix to only about 2% of the mix in something like 8 years. So that was incredibly fast. And I like this example because, as Ioannis mentioned, one famous failure of policy was the French tax on fuels in road transport that caused all the protests. Of course, in fact, that was never a climate change policy. It was just a revenue-raising policy, and Emmanuel Macron decided to present it as a climate policy for the sake of convenience, which was a huge mistake. That was never needed to decarbonize road transport. European regulations were already getting that job done. But contrast that with the carbon price support, the tax in the UK power sector of £18 a tonne. Where were the protests against that? Who even knows about that? In this room, I'm sure people do, but in the general population, virtually nobody does. Nobody ever noticed it because it was a well-designed policy. And back about 5 years ago, when I was working for the energy minister, then there was concern in government about the annual bill for renewable subsidies. It was about £4 billion a year. However, when the Climate Change Committee did a study to look at what impact does that have on the bills of individual consumers, they found those additional costs of subsidizing renewables and paying the carbon tax were more than offset by energy efficiency policies. So the net effect was a reduction in consumer bills. So that's just one example, but it means if you do design policies the right way, you actually can make a fast transition and you don't have to incur significant upfront costs on consumers. In every other sector in the UK, we've done a pretty bad job, so there's a long way to go.
So what should be done now? What would you like to see being done?
Well, that's a tough question to answer in a generic way because it's so different across each sector. But generally, I think there's a big mistake of economists is to suggest that carbon pricing is the most efficient way to decarbonize the economy. That's just not true. You'll hear that from many of the very influential international organizations, but that comes from an economic theory in which innovation doesn't exist. If none of the stuff that everybody was doing in this whole conference hall existed, then carbon pricing would be the most efficient way to decarbonize the economy, because it assumes absolutely nothing changes. But in a world where things do change, what we really have to work with is the reinforcing feedbacks of technology development and diffusion. In other words, when you invest in something, it gets better, it gets cheaper, more people want it, more people buy it, more people invest in it, it gets better, it gets cheaper, and so on. And that feedback, that is why solar power globally, there was more than 10 times as much of it deployed by 2020 as people had expected 15 years earlier. That's the effect of those reinforcing feedbacks. So what we need to do in every sector is identify the right solutions. First, invest in them, subsidize them, use government procurement, do whatever it takes to create those initial markets. Then they'll scale up, they'll get better, and they'll get cheaper. And then after that, we can regulate to force their spread across the whole of the sector and even more rapidly shift investment and bring down the costs. That's what's worked in the power sector, that's what's working in road transport, that's roughly what we need to do in every sector.
And those examples that you give, solar power and coal, that's, they've happened. So what are the equivalents now? Heat pumps, I mean, we talk about heat pumps, they're not being rolled out.
Yeah, absolutely. In heating and buildings, we should be supporting heat pumps very strongly and also regulating for highly efficient building design. Then there's all of the energy-intensive industries, things like steel and cement, where for over a decade we've had carbon pricing, and all it's done is make the fossil-fueled industrial processes a bit more efficient. That's nice, but it's not what we need. So we have to start investing in the zero-emission industrial production processes, which is much tougher, but that will get us where we need to go. And then agriculture and land use, we haven't even begun to talk about. Huge amount of work there to try and figure out what are the low-emission solutions.
It's a big project. So, Ioannis, Simon was talking about the sort of virtuous circle of when there is innovation, when it's seen to be working, the investment flows in, the prices come down. That's the perfect scenario for moving forward. But it takes time, doesn't it? I mean, getting that initial investment into the innovation is not easy.
Absolutely. I think, though, that at this point in time, and I agree with everything that Simon said, I will only disagree on one point, just for the sake of disagreement as well, Simon, on carbon pricing. I think that another negative is that it might have negative unintended consequences. So, for instance, think about the UK imposing a carbon pricing, but that effectively meaning that we are exporting the emissions to China. In other words, we import more things. That's why, for instance, I'm a big fan of the carbon adjustment tax. This is not a local or even national problem, it's a global problem. So if we start this kind of, as you were mentioning, textbook sort of policies without thinking at a global systems level, then we're actually making the problem worse. So that's one footnote that I would add to what you were saying. I do think, though, that to kick off that virtuous cycle that you mentioned, quite literally, governments need to unleash as many funds as they can in precisely what we see in this exhibition hall today. In other words, we need a lot more going into R&D, we need a lot more going into innovation, and I would even take a step back. I think we need a lot more funds going into fundamental research. In other words, we need to rethink about material science, for instance. We need to think about other alternative sources like fusion energy, for instance. We need to throw everything at the problem, because at this point in time, and this is neither pessimistic or optimistic, but at this point in time, I feel that it's not that we have a range of options we need to choose. At this point in time, is all of the above and hope for the best. Right? Because we don't know ultimately what's going to work, especially when it comes to technological innovation. It's unpredictable, it's inherently unpredictable, but we need to at least give it the chance that Simon was saying. And importantly, we need to understand that, yes, this is going to be an upfront investment, but we should never forget that right now, it's not that we are starting from neutral, we're subsidizing fossil fuels. We're actually subsidizing bad technologies. Even when it comes to discussions about monetary policy, and we're thinking, well, should we think about what central banks are doing in terms of green and brown bonds? Well, by not doing anything and by having a central bank reflecting the economy, you're also subsidizing the brown bonds and therefore the brown companies. So it's important to pivot and change that understanding and realize that we are starting from the negative and then going to neutral before we even start subsidizing and accelerating that virtuous cycle.
And we're very much looking to the future and how can things be done. And it's not always helpful, but it is important to look back and think, you're saying about where we're starting from now. We're not starting from here now. We're still there, as in this has been going on for so long. Simon, your book is called 5 Times Faster. Why are we still there in the scenario Ioannis is outlining when we are so close to all of these key moments?
Yeah, sure. I should explain why I called it 5 times faster, and that's because over the last 2 decades, the global economy was decarbonized at a rate of roughly 1.5% per year. That's in terms of emissions per unit global GDP. And if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial, then this decade we have to decarbonize the global economy at roughly 8% per year, so 5 times faster. So I think there are a couple of important changes we have to make. One is to understand the economics of the transition properly, and that's what I was just talking about before. With these tough industrial sectors and agriculture, all of these sectors where we haven't made much progress, Don't waste time just making the fossil system more efficient. We can do that at the same time, but focus more than anything on investing in the new solutions, developing them and spreading them across society. When we do that, then we see we can make progress much faster than we expect. The other thing, I think Ioannis made an important point about seeing this from the global perspective. Obviously we should. These are global transitions in power, transport, industry, agriculture, buildings, and there are many ways in which countries can work together to make those transitions happen more quickly. I think, so the other big thing we have to change is climate change diplomacy. Yeah. What we've had for 30 years is a system of countries talking to each other about economy-wide emissions targets. And all countries in the world talking about that all together. If that's what you do, the best you can have is a very soft process of norm setting. And that's what we've done, and it's worked well in that respect. We have the global targets of 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, net zero. All of that is norm setting. But we now need deep, rapid structural change in the global economy. Norm setting is not enough. And Ioannis mentioned the carbon leakage risk. That's a great example. In steel, for example, a global industry, if we start taxing steel in the UK, we just make it more expensive, we lose it. As he said, it goes to China. So what do you need? Well, you need China, the US, Europe, India, Brazil, sitting down in a room, small group of those countries that easily accounts for 3/4 of the global steel industry, talking about, okay, how do we get this done together? How do we align on standards? How do we shift, first learn from the first demonstration projects, understand what works more quickly than we could do on our own, then maybe coordinate on public procurement to create the first markets for zero-emission steel, and then regulate the global market so you shift the whole thing really quickly. The staggering thing is, that conversation has not yet happened. Mm-hmm. After 30 years of climate change diplomacy, the first conversation of that kind has not yet happened.
So
That's
what are the
we
chances of it ever happening?
No reason why we can't do it.
No reason why, but it hasn't happened yet, so
I
what
think
is
there's
your hope
inertia.
for it happening?
There's great inertia in institutions. People look at the UN climate change negotiations, they look very complex, everybody believes something deep and important must be happening within them, and everybody says that's the only game in town, so that's what we need to do. But there's absolutely nothing stopping the EU, for example, calling a meeting, inviting the Americans and the Chinese, and saying, let's discuss decarbonization of the global steel sector. There are already very many practical initiatives that have the beginnings of that kind of cooperation. So all we're talking about is taking them more seriously, investing the political capital, and scaling them up.
Without it, what are the prospects?
Well, the International Energy Agency says that without serious international cooperation, then the transition to global net zero will be delayed by decades.
I think Simon is bringing in institutions is a very, very important point, because we're dealing with global problems. They're going to be expensive to fix. And at the core of it, there's a free riding problem. If one country fixes it, another country may free ride on the fact that emissions have gone down. So I think I will go a step further than what Simon said and think about the following. A lot of these global institutions that we have set up, think about the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, and so on and so forth. Well, when did we set most of them up? After the Second World War. And their goal, right, it was to recover, make the globe recover after 2 world wars, bring about economic prosperity and peace. Well, unfortunately, that's not enough when you have a global issue like climate change, biodiversity loss, or even income inequalities. In other words, there's a big question mark for me, at least, if these institutions are fit for purpose. In other words, if they can align in a form of global governance, the countries and the governments to come together and address these challenges. And to Simon's point, that's precisely why in 30 years of COPs, we haven't seen the progress that we should have seen. Now, what do we need to do? In my view, is that we need to re-envision, reimagine those institutions, and ultimately make them more inclusive. Because now they essentially reflect current power and economic structures, which to a large extent are vested interests that have every incentive to delay the transition. because they are not yet suffering the consequences. The developing world is. So we need to rethink those institutions, and therefore we are having those discussions. There is a discussion about Bretton Woods 2.0, where these institutions become sort of more fit for global challenges. Is it easy to do? No, of course. I mean, last time we had to do it, we had to go through 2 world wars in order to rethink institutions. But right now, given the state we're in, when climate change and all these other problems, we ought to have that conversation. And similar to what Simon said before, these conversations are still in very early stages, and that's another point where we need to accelerate. And that also has implications, by the way, on what we were discussing earlier about these multilateral institutions and banks and financial institutions that can really play that multiplier effect, de-risk a lot of the necessary investments needed in developing countries, come up with new financial instruments in terms of blended finance, so that governments that can afford to take more risk, and therefore private capital can come in, not only in terms of adaptation, but in general in terms of building climate capacity for those countries that are suffering the most impacts at this point in time. So there needs to be that sort of more, again, going back to the previous point we're making, that more just transition at the global level through this kind of reimagined institutions.
You've given us both so much. You've both given us so much to think about. I just thought we'd wrap up with both of you saying what you would do if you had a magic wand. What would you like? What would make the difference? I mean, I'm guessing it's the joined up thinking is what you'd both like to see, but what would it be? Who wants to go first?
Magic wand question.
Yeah.
I don't know. Last week I was at a conference organized by the governments of America and Denmark, where they invited finance ministries there were about 25 countries present, and lots of people who do economic analysis of the transition. And at the end of this 2-day conference, there was one of these surveys where everyone types something in on their phone and it comes up on the screen. And one of the questions was, what do you think is the most important capability that ministries of finance need to acquire so that they can do a better job on the low carbon transition? And when everybody voted, then the number one thing that flashed up on the screen was systems thinking. And I was really pleased to see that, because mostly the form of economic thinking that is dominant in governments is deeply reductionist. It doesn't think about systems, doesn't think about the reinforcing feedbacks that I was just talking about, that are absolutely central to innovation, scaling up all the good ideas. They don't exist in the standard dominant form of economics that's used in governments. So I was really pleased to see that and heartily agreed with it.
Thank you. Ioannis?
So with my magic wand, I would probably do one thing, and instill a sense of responsibility to every single person. And the reason why I'm saying that is as follows. Sustainability and climate has always been someone else's problem. If you're a person, you'll say, well, but I'm just a person. It's like voting, right? If I'm a person, what difference can I make if everyone else doesn't? And then companies say the same. If I only do this myself in the industry and everyone else doesn't, then we're not going anywhere. And even countries say that. If the UK does it, but China and India and Brazil don't, then we cannot solve it. So that's basically deflecting responsibility. Mm-hmm. So if we own that responsibility as people, as citizens, as companies, and as governments, then we would be much more capable of solving this problem. So my magic wand would be everyone recognizes and takes that responsibility. And I think there lies power, right? Think about every one of us. There's so many wonderful, brilliant entrepreneurs right outside coming up with those innovative solutions. We have the personal capabilities. We also vote with our pockets in every single thing that we buy every day. We also literally vote. We're also having pensions and we save, so we choose the financial institutions. So that's why I said that, and these are not amorphous things. Institutions are run by people. Companies are run by people. Politicians are people that get elected, right? So if we all had a personal sense of responsibility, this is not someone else's problem. This is my problem, and I have many spheres of influence and decisions that I can take, and I can change things, then I think we'll make a long way towards solving the problem.
I like it. Thank you both so much. That's Ioannis, Ioannou and Simon Sharpe. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.